Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Quigley on Divorce, the behind-the-scenes look. I'm your host, James Quigley, and once again, I'm joined by our special guest, Jordan Rosenberg, a regular on the show and one of the stars of my team. Jordan, welcome.
Thanks, James. Appreciate it.
So today's topic is one that's, I guess, a little bit of a mix of some of the ones we've been doing lately, dealing with all of the craziness with COVID, but also combining that with what we've done in the past, where we've given some tips and try to help people out around holidays, when they're going through a divorce, or maybe even you've been divorced, you've got agreements that deal with who gets what holidays and so on and so forth. So today, Jordan, why don't you introduce our top 10 list and what we're going to be speaking on today?
Absolutely. So today is the top 10 holiday COVID tips in divorce. And we'll be having 10 different topics for you today. We'll start, just like you said, James, David Letterman style, 10 to 1. And did you want me to run through all of them?
Absolutely. Let's start with number 10. Very good.
Number 10, check state regulations for travel and COVID restrictions.
Great starting point. I mean, this time of year, in typical times, people travel, right? We're going home for Thanksgiving. Kids are coming home from school. Your kids are in different states. What does it mean? We've got all kinds of restrictions. We here, Jordan, are in Illinois, and some states are on lists that say we shouldn't travel to. Others seem to be okay. As a starting point, you really, I think, want to understand whether or not under your divorce decree, do you have the right to travel during the holidays with your children? If you're in the middle of the divorce, that's going to be another thing. And getting to whether or not that's permissible, you ought to at least determine whether or not the state that you're in has any specific travel restrictions.
Yep. And in that same vein, I think number 9 says check state and local gathering requirements and restrictions. So I think for this one, just along the lines of that, is just get educated and understand where your state stands in terms of the COVID protocol, what certain gathering requirements and restrictions are, and make sure that your plans align with what the restrictions are.
Yeah, and that to me is really sort of I'll use the word interesting because all this stuff is, I guess, interesting on a level as much as it's frustrating. But even the city in which you're in versus the state, there might be different regulations. I'm hearing certain things where, and sometimes it even comes down to political lines. The governor of a state might have recommendations or suggestions or mandates. It's all across the board. But then your individual municipalities may either be giving a different message. Maybe it's more restrictive in the municipalities. Maybe some of the municipalities are saying, hey, we're going to take a more liberal approach. What's the enforcement of that? And for example, in Chicago, I mean, it just came down today. Our mayor in the city of Chicago has promulgated additional suggestions, recommendations. It's a little bit hard to understand whether it's really what the consequence is. They seem to be suggestions, but know your municipality in addition to your state.
Yeah. So number 8 is consider testing for all family sufficiently in advance of all gatherings. And so I can take this one, James. And I mean, sure. Just say even my family recently, we decided to kind of go up north to Wisconsin and get a house, and all of us got tested in advance. And so we were able to kind of be comfortable and understanding that nobody had COVID, and didn't need to wear a mask, at least because we were all sufficiently satisfied with the results of COVID that we weren't transmitting it to each other. So maybe something to consider in advance of Thanksgiving plans. I know testing is widely available now. I think even Walgreens may do rapid tests, but definitely just to kind of put your mind at ease, to take the proper protocol, something to consider.
Yeah, but let me, I'll take that in a different direction. Your example, Jordan, it's your family. Thank God you're not in the middle of a divorce and you're not divorced, but that's something you guys are doing as a family. What if you were in the middle of a divorce and your spouse said, oh, no, you don't? Wisconsin happens to be on one of these lists in Illinois that for some reason, if you cross the border into Wisconsin, I'm not going to get into trying to understand the logic in any of this stuff, but they say if you go to Wisconsin, you must quarantine when you come back into the city of Chicago for 14 days. So if I'm a parent and I say, wait a minute, do I think there's anything really inherently unsafe about you going into Wisconsin and renting a home with your family? Maybe not. But then if you come back and our child is supposed to quarantine for the next 14 days, how does that work? I'm not going to agree to you taking our child out of state for a week, enjoying your vacation, and then coming back and that child has to be quarantined. The child presumptively has to quarantine with the family that came back. So you're going to have 3 weeks in a row with our child.
Right.
And this gets into what the very sticky stuff is that we are, and I bring up these examples, or the one I just did, because these are real-time issues we are dealing with in the world of divorce and the holidays and COVID.
So I think moving on to number 7, front issues of high-risk family members, anyone feeling COVID symptoms, and expectations about face coverings and social distancing.
I'll throw out a personal one on this one. Candidly, I have family that is all over the board politically. They're all over the board in terms of how they view not only the coronavirus, but the restrictions and the freedoms and all of this stuff that the entire country is dealing with. I think going into any kind of holiday gathering, you need to have those conversations up front, because you'd hate to show up with your child. You've got your parenting time in a divorcing situation. You go there and it just turns into be a nightmare for the kids because people are expecting people to wear masks, or they didn't know, Grandpa Mac had the bad lungs and how could you not have a mask? And so it seems sort of fundamental, but I think a lot of people are uncomfortable having those conversations. And I think even between divorcing parties or people that have already been divorced, you got to front these issues. Hey, we're divorced, and I know it's your Thanksgiving this year, but Uncle Bud is I don't, he's got a bad heart. Is this a good idea? So I think just fronting those very hard conversations or awkward conversations might save some problems down the line.
No, I agree. And I mean, it's weird to me that those conversations are awkward, right? And I feel like it's sort of it's sort of like if you're the one that's insisting on the face covering or insisting on more restrictions, then it's sort of like it's sort of an awkward thing for you to be defiant about. And that's just, I think that's the stigma, which is interesting, because if you're going to Thanksgiving and you show up with your mask and your shield, and that's your expectation, you don't front those issues, and everybody's at Thanksgiving without masks and everyone's hugging and kissing, I mean, that puts you in a very awkward position, right? And so I agree with you 100% that it's important not only to front those issues within your family, but number 2 is you have to be able to talk about them with your spouse or ex-spouse so that you guys can be on the same page to understand what's going to happen at everybody's parties and Thanksgiving with their families.
Yeah. It's interesting too, because there's another layer we see sometimes too in divorce. It's not, I don't want to say it's commonplace, but it's also not uncommon for divorcing spouses to, physically separate during the process. And sometimes what you see is one of the parties will go and live with their folks, grandma and grandpa, live in the same community. They have a big home. I'm going to go stay with them. And so, okay, great. So we're separated. We're going through this divorce process. And now you want to take our 2 kids to your celebration, and where I don't know if everyone's going to have masks and shields and hazmat suits and the whole thing. And then the kids come back, and I'm living with grandma and grandpa who are in their 80s. And I'm not, so again, fronting these issues and being respectful of those kind of concerns. Again, these are just tips. We don't have the answers, and some of these things may seem obvious, but probably some things to think about for sure.
Definitely. So next point we have is number 6, consult physician or pediatrician for travel/gathering recommendations. And that, because in parentheses, you'll see physician's advice may be relevant in court. And this is, I mean, again, James, this is just interesting, because as COVID has progressed, and it's been around since March now, we've run into issue after issue after issue after issue as it relates to parenting and COVID. And everyone says, well, what do courts do in this circumstance? What does this judge do in terms of handling COVID protocols and uniformity throughout the party's parenting time? I mean, and what we always say is it depends, obviously, on the situation, depends on the judge, depends on how it's presented, depends on who's involved. But in one case that we had in particular, our client wanted to travel to Wisconsin. And to try to prevent that, the ex-spouse got a pediatrician's note that said, traveling to Wisconsin is, would be harmful to the kid's health, basically. And the judge ultimately ruled that that was a speculative, because again, no one really understands what COVID is. I think we have a better idea now than when we heard this case. But again, you're sort of it's situational. You have the pediatrician who says it's dangerous. Of course it's dangerous. That's what the CDC says. That's what the municipality says. That's what the state says. But is it really dangerous depending on that unique circumstance of the case? We don't know.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's important. I had a similar case. This was actually involved the request to take a small child to New York. And it seemed like a reasonable, why wouldn't we be able to take the trip? It was, the father had family there. Until the judge was made aware of the fact that the child had been to see the doctor just days before, had a fever. The state of New York had their own quarantine laws, so that if the child had gone to New York, the child actually would have had to quarantine in New York for 14 days. And they were only going to be there for 7 days.
Yeah.
So, I think it was really probative to have, in that case, the guardian ad litem was given the time by the judge to actually talk with the pediatrician, where I believe the judge had intimated an inclination just off the cuff to say, sure, it sounds fine. And then you take a deeper dive and you understand doctors are saying, no, child had a high fever. Combine that with the regulations we talked about from state to state. And, that was a situation where the trip didn't take place.
Right.
So understanding the medical aspect of this as much as you can, getting a doctor's advice as it relates to the safety of your children. Come on, it's common sense.
Right.
And what the parents do with that, at least, from us giving a tip, probably makes sense as a starting point to get that doctor's opinion on things.
Absolutely. Number 5, file any petitions or motions with the court sufficiently in advance, as courts generally do not address these issues as emergencies.
Yeah, general rule of thumb. And that we've said this in other podcast episodes before. It doesn't, courts, basically the third Thursday of every November is Thanksgiving. Christmas is every December 25th. New Year's Day is New Year's Day every year. Jordan, some of the Jewish holidays, move a little bit, but by and large, they're on the calendar well in advance. So right. You come in and here we are, less than a week away from Thanksgiving. You want to go into court next week and say on an emergency basis, judge, I want, parenting time for Thanksgiving. You're going to get a lot of judges say, well, I'm sorry, I'm not going to put aside all the other cases and deal with this because it's not an emergency. You knew about this, you should have planned it. Now, with COVID, had a plan, had an agreement, all of a sudden now, just today, the mayor of the city of Chicago implemented these new regulations. Does that alter things that might create a basis to go in an emergency? Maybe. Could be a little different, but generally speaking, get it out there, deal with this stuff in advance.
Right, and even just some further background on that. I mean, if you don't plan in advance, and just like a scenario that you said, James, is you can't come in a week before court and say, oh, you know what, even though a court, we haven't filed for divorce, or we just filed for divorce, or even if we've filed for divorce for, we've had a pending case for the last 6 months. Can't just come in a week in advance and say, judge, a sudden unforeseen circumstance is happening, Christmas is approaching. And 9 times out of 10, the judge is going to look at you and be like, yeah. Third Thursday of, December 24th or 25th of every year. And so those aren't emergencies. And so again, just, front those issues as far in advance, even if it's uncomfortable and it disrupts plans for this year. There's not much, I don't think, a court can do in those circumstances. Yep. So number 4, discuss with spouse, ex-spouse, spouse each parent's position on COVID protocol for the holidays?
We see this, that in many households, mom and dad aren't necessarily of the same ilk regarding COVID, regarding travel, regarding a lot of things. And, unfortunately in a divorce, it probably is even exacerbated. So if you have one parent who's, thinks that COVID is Armageddon, and then you've got, the other parent who thinks it's not even the sniffles, you can imagine they're going to come at this very differently. So I think it's a hard conversation. Again, a lot of these tips we're saying, they're sort of awkward.
Right.
You might even envision getting pushback, an argument, a fight, maybe even consider mediation over some of these issues. But I think it's a fair question to say, well, how do you feel about this? How do you feel about traveling around the holidays? How do you feel about family members coming in? They say some of these gatherings, only 10 people. We typically have 50 for Thanksgiving. So, are you okay with that? Again, a lot of this stuff is being proactive, heading it off as much as you can. But when you do that, I would also, suggest that people try to step out of your shoes and how you view this issue a little bit, just to try to hear the other side, with hopes that you guys can come to some consensus on these issues, because ultimately it's your kids. And what's their takeaway going to be from this holiday season in terms of how mom and dad handled it?
Yeah. Can I put you on the spot for a second, James?
Yeah.
So I'll ask you. So I know that a lot of our clients, and probably a lot of people watching, are going to be thinking to themselves, well, it'd be great if we were on the same page and we were able to step outside of ourselves and kind of think reasonably in terms of that. I mean, what advice do you give to our listeners and watchers to say, if we don't have this planned and we're divergently different in terms of where we stand on COVID and protocols, I mean, what do you do?
Well, we'll get to that a little further down in our top 10 list.
Okay.
One. But I think generally speaking it puts you in a position, you have to understand this. If you can't agree on these things, and if you can't see eye to eye, you're going to have someone else decide it for you. There's a step that you can engage in. I mentioned mediation before. There's a lot of really good mediators that, if you are willing to at least have an open mind, hear what the other side has to say, try to see if there's a compromise, that might be a good option to try to avoid having to go to court on these things.
Yep.
And I will say this before we get to the top three, which is now it's getting exciting now, and I think
now it's getting exciting.
Yeah, they're on the edge of their seat waiting for the top three. But and in saying that, I completely forgot what I was just going to say. I had a great piece of advice. So let's move on to number three.
It'll come back, James.
It'll come back.
All right. Number three, notify in writing to spouse/ex-spouse with itinerary of any travel plans. If divorced, strictly adhere to all requirements within your parenting agreement.
Yeah. I mean, Jordan, that in pretty much every parenting agreement, or what we call allocation judgments here in Illinois, that's a fairly typical requirement. In ordinary times, you're divorced, you want to go out of state for Thanksgiving, it's fine, generally speaking, but you got to tell me where you're going to be, when are you leaving. If you're flying somewhere, I'm entitled to the flight number. If you're staying in a hotel, what's the name of the hotel? Basic stuff. It probably even more so in these times, because as a parent in divorce or already divorced, the other spouse or ex-spouse is going to want to really be able to understand, wait a minute, you're going to New York,
right?
You're going to a hotbed of, whatever the city or state is, of cases or deaths or whatever. I mean, I'm not down for that. Or, okay, understand where you're going, understand how you're getting there. And by the way, you're driving instead of flying. Oh, okay, so I maybe feel more comfortable with that. You got to get these issues out there, because ultimately, circling back to one of our earlier tips, is fronting these issues early.
Right.
You got to have time to deal with this stuff if there's not going to be an agreement.
Yeah. And I mean, and just kind of to your point earlier, I mean, these are tips that we're providing. And I know that a lot of the answers to a lot of the questions that people have in terms of what do you do about this, what do you do about that related to COVID are probably gray and they're not black and white, but these are tips to follow to help like as smooth of a transition as possible and smoothest decision making as possible, so you can avoid putting yourself in the situation where you have those questions.
Yep.
So agreed. Proactivity, put things in writing, be specific, follow your agreements to the T, because if there was a court appearance or a court date, you know, my guess is the judge would say, okay, well, what does your parenting agreement say? What does the order say? That's the starting point.
Yep.
So number 2, and this puts a bow on everything that we've been talking about, plan holiday travel / gatherings as far in advance as possible.
Yeah. And you know what, I'm kind of, that seems obvious, but I would take it a step further and even kind of remove this out of the realm of COVID, even though that's, you know, the cloud that hangs over this holiday season. As you look to next year and the year after, I would keep 2 things in mind. Remember all these tips for then, but I'd also suggest to people, let's not freak out this year. Let's assume that because of the spouse you're divorcing or have already divorced, they're really, really passionate about this issue. They're really freaked out about it. Maybe you don't see it that same way, but because of that, let's make things easier for the kids by not getting into a big to-do. Try to make the best of your 10-person Thanksgiving dinner or whatever it might be, and understand that the more we can not fight over these issues, you know, and keep our acrimony from cascading down onto the children, that's really the goal. That's honestly the goal, because all your kids are going to remember about this Thanksgiving is that because of COVID, mom and dad blew up and we didn't get to go see this or that. You know, try to make it as normal for the kids and realize you're going to get back on track and we're going to have family gatherings, and next holiday season, let's plan in advance. So that's sort of a divergence, but again, you know, that's a good general rule for any parents in divorce or getting divorced. It's the planning aspect. The sooner you confront this stuff, you may have issues with it, but get it out there, plan in advance, because ultimately then the kids don't know any of it. And all they know is, hey, we're going to Florida, or we're going to Wisconsin, or we're staying home. And they have something to plan. They can get excited about. It happens. They're none the worse for their mom's, you know, contention because they don't know about it. Plan in advance.
And I think even your later point in just being flexible is super, super important. And I think this holiday season with COVID just reminds us that literally anything can happen at any time, right? Yep. And so again, just focus on your children, make sure it's as normal as possible for them. And I mean, even an anecdote about a case that we have. So we have a case where we represent our client. He lives in Chicago. Mom and daughter actually live in China. And there's specific provisions as to what happens for the holidays, for Thanksgiving, for Christmas, for winter break, and which involves the daughter coming to the United States and vice versa, sometimes the father going to China. Now, obviously, that's not happening this year. So while a lot of people, while at least our client was extremely upset by that, he very much understands the severity of what's happening, at least in the tensions with the US and China right now, and the divergence in how, you know, how COVID's being handled and the severity of it. So our client understands now. He's like, listen, like, I get it. We're going to make the best of it. Let's just make it as normal as possible for our daughter understanding these circumstances.
Yep. Complicated. Jordan, I'm literally on the edge of my seat.
This is the number one most important tip. Yeah. Top holiday divorce tip, COVID ever.
Right. And what makes it even more exciting is I literally, in these COVID times, I'm podcasting from my bedroom. So
here we go.
This is as COVID as it gets. Number one, lay it out there.
Can I get a drum roll, James? Is that too much?
Probably not. Probably not.
Very good. Very good. Last tip. If you have any questions or concerns call James and Jordan.
I mean, that should have been probably 1 through 10.
Agreed.
But we joke about it, but the reality of it is you're going to have questions. And a lot of this stuff is uncharted. We at least have the experience of, like you mentioned, some of the anecdotes. We have actual cases. We've had situations. We've been in court on these issues. We can at least give perspective. That's the least we can give. We certainly can give litigation advice and experience. You know, if we need to get into court on a matter, we can do that. We will do that. We can work and negotiate issues, which we've been doing on behalf of our clients in the recent weeks, in negotiating with attorneys and really trying to come up with negotiated resolutions out of court, which ultimately is what's best. So and if you have a lawyer, then contact the lawyer you're working with. Make sure you're doing the right thing before you take any steps to exercise self-help. If you think you're on the right track, check with your lawyer. If you don't have a lawyer, contact us. Get good legal advice around these very, very tricky issues this year.
Couldn't have said it better myself, James.
You probably could have.
Maybe, but that sums it up. I think just be educated. If you have a question, there shouldn't be a hesitancy ever to contact your lawyer if you have one, or us, because we're happy to help and answer any questions. And even this podcast is going to raise a million questions for people. And so again, we're available and we're happy to help.
Yeah, and again, this we try to make this a little bit lighthearted, recognizing that just if you're a divorcing family in general, you couldn't be in the middle of a more brutal process to begin with, or recently divorced, and then to layer on top of it all of this stuff, which all of us are really, really struggling with. We want our freedoms. We want our lives back. We don't want to be told what to do. Some of us aren't even comfortable wearing masks. It's hard to breathe and those kinds of things. And so you add that to the mix of this already complicated dynamic that a lot of families are in. And then you add this upcoming dynamic of the holiday season, which again, for other families in and of itself can be stressful. We're not minimizing that stress and the suffering and the pain that everyone's in. And we're just trying to kind of help people plow through it the way we, with our families, with our office. Every day it's a new challenge. There's a new promulgation we have to deal with. We hope that you all have some moment of peace during these holidays, and that you find some comfort in your families in whatever way you can. If it means, we did this last with me, was Easter, I think, and we got everybody on these, the Zoom, and it's kind of weird, it's kind of odd, but it was, a way to connect. So we hope the best for all of you. We are here to help you guys at any time. We hope these tips, simple as they are, maybe get you guys thinking, and to prepare yourself to hopefully make this holiday season as peaceful and joyful as possible for all you guys. So, Jordan, thanks again for joining.
Absolutely.
We will
be back.
Yes, we'll definitely have you back. It won't be long. We'll be in 2021 with a new fire in our belly, and we're going to be, finding great things to talk about. And we're always willing to hear from you as viewers and listeners. If you have ideas or questions, sometimes we get emails offline. Our website is www.beermannlaw.com. It's B as in boy, EERMANN, beermannlaw.com. And Jordan and myself have our individual profiles there. You can contact us, email us directly, call us directly. And we are more than happy to not only answer questions for you directly, help you out if needed, or just be open to questions or topics you would like to hear us give a little more insight, and we're happy to do that coming into the new year. We will be back. Thanks again, everybody, and have a great holiday season.